Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. When we started this podcast back in August 2022, Calum and I announced the theme to be Anticipating and Managing Exponential Impact. We talked about three sub-themes: developing the skills of exponential foresight, distinguishing between scenarios, whether they were plausible or implausible, and whether they were desirable or undesirable, and thirdly, supporting the community of collaborative exponential foresight. 126 episodes later, as we reach the transition between 2025 and 2026, it's a good time for the two of us to take stock. Accordingly, in this episode, Calum and I will each be picking out a number of events from the last 12 months, which we see as potential signals of larger exponential impact ahead. Calum, why don't you pick out the first group of events?
I will, but first of all, David, we've just finished Christmas. Did you have a good Christmas?
I've had a very fine Christmas. I had the future with me, namely the next generation but one, and seeing the world in different eyes, the eyes of a 13-month-year-old and a 63-month-year-old.
Excellent. Well, I hope you were showing them some totally inappropriate material, because that is the role of grandparents.
No comment.
Fair enough. Okay, so my first choice for a development last year, which is also going to be a development next year, is the rapid improvement of large language models. Like, I guess everybody who uses these things a lot, each time there's a new model comes out, I'm stunned by how good it is. And recently, I switched from OpenAI. I've been a long time loyal user of OpenAI. I switched to Gemini when Gemini 3 came out, the Google DeepMind model. I did that partly because actually I do think it's better, but also because it seems some of the leadership of OpenAI are going down the same rabbit hole that the founders of A16Z have gone down and becoming Trumpy, which stretches my patience too much. So these large language models, they are much, much better than they used to be. They still hallucinate a bit, but an awful lot less. They are capable of reasoning.
And that's despite the fact that many people are saying AI pilots are failing. There's lots of evidence that companies who trial AI aren't getting much good out of it. Lots of other people saying, hey, these large language models, they're hitting a wall, they're architecturally limited, there's not much more they can do.
The metaphor I find very helpful in thinking about that is the jagged edge. The models are brilliant at some things. They can write a consultancy paper, they can summarize and critique a novel in moments. They can produce fantastic imagery, but they lack common sense. Common sense, I think, is probably the phrase that captures the difference that still exists between large language models and humans. We don't know exactly what that is, and we don't know all the things that comprise it. I wrote an article earlier in the year trying to list the things that large language models need to have in order to bridge the gap between them and us. Somebody's encapsulated quite well with this idea of a jagged edge. The original drawing of the jagged edge was like a little bubble, which is human capability. And then superimposed on that was a splash of ink, an ink blot for large language models. And originally, the ink blot was quite small and almost entirely within the human boundary. And now there's quite a lot of the ink blot which is outside the human boundary. The models are better than us at many things, but there's still some things that we can do that they can't do. So if you're trying to use AIs to run a process within an organization, something really quite complicated, they're not good enough for that. But what they are really good at is helping you think through an issue, helping you draft a document, reviewing and critiquing a document. So yeah, I just find them, frankly, miraculous.
My own view is that people who say the AIs aren't very intelligent often aren't very intelligent themselves in how they are trying to use the AIs. When they complain that AIs lack creativity, they aren't being very creative themselves in trying to get the AIs to think outside the box. But if you do experiment with them, it can be amazing what results. So I'm in no doubt that the large language models, as we keep calling them, even though there's a heck of a lot more bolted onto them, I've no doubt that they're going to get a lot more capable in 2026.
Yeah, I'm absolutely sure of that. And I still see no sign whatsoever of a silicon ceiling. I see no reason to believe that there will be a stopping point and that they won't overtake us in every potential aspect. It'll probably take longer than the aficionados think. Something else that's popped up this year A metaphor or a way of thinking of things is dividing the world of people who take AI seriously, which is a small world, probably much less than 1% of the human race. But dividing that world up into three groups: accelerationists, who just think this is all going to be wonderful, let's do it as fast as possible; doomers, who think it is inevitably going to be disastrous, let's stop; and scouts, who think, well, it could be great, it could be disastrous, let's figure out how to make it great. Actually, the metaphor is not complete, because there should be another group, which I would fall into, which says this could be absolutely wonderful, it could be really terrible, we probably can't do very much to determine which of those we get. Let's just hope, or not let's just hope, but we have to hope that it will be wonderful.
So you're the people who pray rather than the people who actually get involved in doing things?
Well, no, certainly not failing to get involved. I am active and intend to be more so next year, particularly on the economic singularity, what we do about a future with no jobs. But I also do think there is one possible thing we can do about superintelligence, as you know, David, because we've discussed this before. I think the biggest difference we could make to superintelligence, the thing that will last, the thing that probably won't change, is to decide whether it's conscious or not. We may not have that option, but it does look at the moment as if we might, even though we don't understand consciousness. In fact, we can't even define it. I have a personal hunch, I'm not the only person who thinks this, but I think it's probably a minority view at the moment, that if we are faced with the choice between the first superintelligence being a zombie, having no consciousness, or being aware, I think we would be better off if it's aware than if it's a zombie. But that certainly doesn't guarantee that everything will be wonderful.
So we're both in that same broad group you've called scouts, which is we think that we can make a difference. We're not sure how easy it's going to be to make a difference. It's probably going to be very difficult to make a difference. Is it going to be impossibly difficult or just very difficult? We're not sure. But it is absolutely worth figuring out what the levers are. So one of my phrases for 2026 is from forecasts to levers. It's not enough just to forecast what may or may not happen. It's more important to figure out how do we actually improve the world. And I confess I'm quoting Karl Marx here, whose tombstone in North London says, philosophers have interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. So I want to get involved in actively understanding the connections of power, which parts of power are amenable to change, which parts of power are so solidified that there's no point going anywhere near them. So that's one of my own visions for 2026.
Well, it's good to have old Karl Marx quoted every now and then, I suppose. I think you are more scouty than me, aren't you? You actually think that it may well be possible to either constrain superintelligence or to mold it in some way to make it more beneficial to us.
I think we can constrain developers. I'm not sure we could constrain superintelligence once it arrives. So I'm very much in the pause AI camp. Not that we'll pause all AI, so that term's misleading. Control AI is a different organization which has basically the same aspiration, but maybe their name is more suitable. But it's not the AI itself, it's more the developers of AI that need to be steered so that they are less likely just to produce something in response to perceived financial short-term benefits, share price and so on. And instead, they are truly taking safety issues into consideration. Of course, it's something we've never quite managed to do before as a species, but there are some simpler examples like stopping emitting CFCs into the atmosphere. That was something that the big chemical companies objected to initially. They said they needed the CFCs, there was no alternative, but it turns out that we could find alternatives, and so we didn't need to destroy the ozone layer with our aerosols and our refrigerants. It's harder in this AI case because swapping from a potentially dangerous mode of AI development to a more safe mode of AI development isn't at all clear-cut, but I think it's what we need to focus on. So that's part of what I'll be trying to do in this scout activity.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Imagine being in the boardroom with the world's most influential C-suite executives, exploring big questions about the economy, AI, and hybrid work. Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, hosted by Steve Odland, President and CEO of the Conference Board, the ultimate podcast for professionals seeking the truth beyond trending headlines. Cut through the noise and dive into data-driven discussions, unbiased, nonpartisan, and straight from the top. Listen to C-Suite Perspectives and harness the power of trusted insights for what's ahead.
That does strike me as being a heroic hope. The CFC's example is quite good, but having a better CFC than your competitor doesn't mean you win every battle. It doesn't mean that you are going to be the most powerful company in the world and that you're going to be the most powerful army in the world, whereas having a better AI does mean that. And the number of people who can make CFCs on a globally impactful level is pretty small, whereas the number of people who will in the years to come be able to develop the next AI model, whatever it is, will be very large. So it strikes me with many actors and enormous, the biggest possible incentive to continue development. There's no chance of a pause. I agree with you, a pause would be the rational thing to do. If humanity was a rigorously rational species, there's no way we would continue this experiment in figuring out how to turn ourselves into chimpanzees, the second smartest species on the planet. But given that we're not rational like that, I think it's absolutely inevitable we will continue.
So what might change things is a greater appreciation of the risks. And so one of my themes for 2025 and going into 2026 is the risks for something that's been around for a while, but I argue is getting worse, which is cyber attacks and cyber hacking. By various statistics, the impact of cyber crime in 2025 was larger than ever. There was an attack on Jaguar Land Rover, a car manufacturer in the UK, which has been estimated to have cost the UK economy about £2 billion, which makes it the most costly cyber incident in UK history. And UK car production plunged as Jaguar Land Rover was shut down for a while. So September 2025 was the lowest month of production in cars in the UK since, I think, the 1950s. The North Koreans are going hell for leather with their cyber attacks. I don't think they were responsible for Jaguar Land Rover. It's a complicated story, but they were certainly responsible for other cyber attacks, and they have a record-breaking year too with about £2 billion in what they managed to steal from various places. And what's going to make it more complicated is when people manage to loop AI systems into their cyber attacks. There was a report from Anthropic who had detected that a Chinese state-sponsored threat actor had been attempting to use a jailbroken version of their Claude AI as the central figure of a large-scale cyber espionage campaign. And so if we don't want ourselves to be attacked and have all our assets removed, we're going to have to figure out how we control this. And when we're able to figure out how to control cyber attacks, that's halfway, conceptually at least, to controlling AI.
Do we know who did cause the cyber attack on Jaguar?
The common theory is it's a bunch of youngsters, British youngsters. They were certainly responsible for similar large attacks in the UK on Marks and Spencer's and the Co-op. And it was people who are disenchanted with the world. Clever people who get involved in online gaming communities. When they show off their virtuosity to each other, they feel no loyalty to society as a whole for various adolescent, teenage or early 20s angst. They want to show off and they're out of control. And the problem is they can much more easily get a hold of very dangerous tools than previous generations, who of course went through similar ups and downs in their psychological evolution. So they can find on the dark web various tools. There are online communities where they see themselves as good guys, in a sense, holding the man, holding society to threat without thinking through the consequences of shutting down hospitals or shutting down the economy. So that's part of it. But the biggest threat may come from the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Israelis, the Chinese, and whoever else who wants to attack. I have to confess, I was attacked myself. Thankfully, my intuition managed to avoid me clicking enough buttons that would drain my limited cryptocurrency assets. I had received a message on Telegram. It seemed to be from somebody I hadn't spoken to for a while, a London Futurist who I followed online. Can we schedule a meeting? She had something she wanted to discuss with me, so we scheduled a meeting on Telegram. When the time came, there was a Zoom link. I clicked on the Zoom link and it said, this meeting ID is invalid. I said, look, please meet on my Zoom link instead. And she said, or the person impersonating her said, click again, click on this. By the way, it's not a normal Zoom meeting, it's a web Zoom meeting. So I clicked on that, and this time it seemed to be like a Zoom meeting, except that it said audio disabled. And there seemed to be a video of her and two other people. I said on Telegram, look, I'm having problems. And she said, oh, not this again. I know what to do. You've got to update your Zoom SDK. Here, I'll talk you through this. And I said, no, I have no time for all this. I had no intention of installing a Zoom SDK. I said, if you want to chat, please join me on my regular Zoom account. The person said, I'm so sorry. I've got all my friends here ready to talk to you. They're very interested in talking to you. And I said, get in this other Zoom call in 5 minutes or the whole thing's off. But thankfully, this prevented me from clicking on any links that the person would send. And later, I did hear from the real person who sent out a message on social media saying, if you are an acquaintance of her, beware, because some of her associates had actually installed the malware and had had their crypto wallets drained as a result. So I was lucky, perhaps. I should have verified with her, the real person, before I went ahead. But there is going to be more cyber attacks, and we need to improve our defense.
That's very interesting. So the clever bit of that was where the damage was going to be caused was by you changing your SDK.
Installing something called an update to a Zoom SDK.
Which is a developer kit, is it?
SDK means software development kit, yes.
Yeah.
And the person masquerading said, we're not using standard Zoom because we have to be very careful because they positioned themselves as being in Ukraine. They needed to be very careful with communications.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
Cleverly done.
And the kids who attacked Jaguar, have they been caught?
I'm not sure it is established who was involved there.
Right.
And the ones involved in Marks and Spencer and the Co-op, I think some of them have been arrested, yes, because they made some mistakes and they were found out.
Well, it's a scary world, isn't it? My next subject would be the AI investment bubble. I don't think you can talk about AI at a time like this without thinking about the AI investment bubble, which is primarily investments in data centers and chips, and obviously the energy production facilities to go with that. It is, by all accounts, something on the order of 10 times bigger now than the Apollo project, which landed Neil Armstrong on the moon. The financing of it has got some questionable aspects. It does seem to be circular. For instance, NVIDIA invests billions into OpenAI, and then OpenAI spends that money right back on buying NVIDIA chips. Vendor financing sends shivers down the spine of some older financiers. It was largely debt-free until recently, but Oracle started taking on debt. Meta has taken on quite a bit of debt, and Google has invented a new instrument. So debt is appearing in this bubble. So it's huge, but the companies that are spending most of the money are enormous, and they have very good, solid businesses which are not to do with the bubble. It's extraordinarily unlikely that Google or Microsoft or Meta will go down as a result of a disappointment in AI. The thing that could deflate the bubble or possibly even pop it is if the investments turn out to be unwarranted because AI doesn't create the value that everybody thinks it will do, and therefore the assets that have been acquired are worth a lot less, and so the companies are worth a lot less. But as I say, the companies doing most of the spend are so big, they have so much resources that they may not emerge entirely unscathed, but they're unlikely to be seriously damaged if the bubble does deflate or even burst. But of course, we're always in a position where we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and anything could happen.
I wouldn't be terribly surprised if OpenAI went out of business because they are a one-track pony by and large. But many of the others that we've spoken about, whether it's Microsoft or Amazon or Google, they have multiple product lines. Perhaps some of their main value is dependent on assumptions of ongoing AI business, and perhaps that will reduce, might even come down, 50% or more. But it wouldn't mean that AI will stop. It will just mean that perhaps there are some more rational valuations involved.
Yeah. So OpenAI looked invulnerable and almost all-powerful in the middle of the year. They've got themselves into the enviable position that they are the Hoover of AI. For most people, when they talk about large language models, they talk about ChatGPT. They have overwhelming market share in consumer use of large language models. They don't have market leadership in commercial use. I believe Claude is in the lead there from Anthropic. But they were very, very solid. And then Gemini 3 comes along, looks like it's better. And then suddenly you think, oh, why is OpenAI worth all this money? If another model can come along and be better than OpenAI's latest, what has OpenAI actually got? It hasn't got any other businesses. So yeah, they do look a lot more vulnerable. But I suppose if you want to think of a worst case scenario, the worst case scenario is that either a Chinese developer or some other developer comes up with a new open source model or an entirely different way of doing AI, not depending on transformer technology, not a large language model. Maybe a neuromorphic model comes along and it is suddenly a lot better. And let's say it doesn't need GPUs, or let's say it doesn't need anything like the same number of GPUs to be effective. And then suddenly, overnight, NVIDIA, which is now a $5 trillion company, I think, is worth an awful lot less. Now, that's a big chunk of the US stock market, and the US stock market is a big chunk of the world stock market. The worst case scenario is something like that happens, and a big chunk gets taken out of the world's asset value.
And I guess that could cause a lot of angst, anxiety. A lot of people would be up in arms because a lot of their personal wealth may be tied up in shares in these companies. Maybe their pensions are heavily invested in these companies. Maybe they'll have a lot less wealth than they thought they were going to have. And that could feed on to populist backlash against the current elites.
Yeah, and one thing we don't need more of in the world at the moment is populist backlash. So let's move smartly along to something much nicer to think about, has its downsides as well. The rise of AI agents. 2025 was supposed to be the year of AI agents. It was certainly a year in which they were talked about a lot. AI agents, I'm sure most of our listeners know, are AI models which can impact the real world. So they don't just fetch or process information, they take actions. They can make a restaurant booking for you, they can book travel for you, they can reconcile your accounts and communicate with the bank. Ultimately, they will run divisions in companies and run whole companies, maybe run whole countries. They are at a very early stage at the moment. There are lots of agents in the world, but they are mostly information retrieval and information processing still. But I think in 2026, that's going to change. They're going to get more sophisticated, partly because they're going to be able to access tools, software tools, and impact the world that way. And then, as time goes on, possibly not next year, but 27, they will start to be able to replicate a lot of what a human does when they're working in a team of people with other agents and with other humans. I've got a dog in this race, and so have you, David, in that a company I'm a co-founder of and you're an advisor of, which is called Contium, has developed a platform on which people who are deploying agents can test their agents. They can run them through simulations to find out whether they do what they're supposed to do and don't do what they're not supposed to do, which is really mission critical, because if you're going to send an agent out into the world and it's going to perform its function to some degree without supervision, you really want to know that it just does what it's supposed to do and nothing else.
Well, I had a demonstration of a kind of agent in the last few days. I saw somebody who created a mobile app just by speaking a few instructions. He gave the design in a bit of text. The app was created and he iterated again and again on text, change the design, do this, put in this, and put in this. And the way he described it, it's coding, but you're not meant to look at the code. You just look at the outcome. And not only did it write the app, but it could also store the code on GitHub and also push out the app so that somebody else could download it and get a hold of it. So this was using software agent tools for a pretty impressive result in a short period of time. There's no need to understand the actual programming language anymore. It was simply, I would like the app to do this. Here's the broad requirements I've got. And it produced a pretty good result, as far as I can see. And it was easy to iterate when, oh, this isn't quite what I expected. Yes, let's modify this and let's put this feature in as well. So it could be done by talking to it. When I say talking, it was typed rather than verbal instructions. The agent was using a bunch of different software tools and interacting with the outside world too. So I can see this is coming along. And I said, well, Aren't there problems with the quality of the code? And the response is, well, you're not meant to look at the code. If it works, it works. And using my own software architectural background, I said, isn't there technical debt? The idea that if you are sometimes too quick to write code, you end up with something that works, but it's hard to modify. He said, well, it's not technical debt if it still does what you want it to do, is it? He was slightly unsure about that, but it did have the impressive outcome. So I can see agents are coming along.
Yeah. And I think in many ways, they're going to make our lives much better, much less frustration. I recently did something which I have to do from time to time, we all have to do, which is to renew an insurance policy. My heart sinks every time I get an email from an insurance company saying your policy's up for renewal. Very often they say, we will auto-renew it unless you tell us not to within the next 10 days or something. Because going through the process of getting comparative quotes for insurance policies is stupefyingly annoying, irritating, boring, and time-consuming. And I had Gemini do it instead. It saved me probably half an hour's work, maybe a bit more. It saved me a lot of frustration and annoyance. And I hope that it got the right result. It certainly got me a quote which was no higher than last year's. Insurance policies typically do notch up each year. So it seems to have saved me money. It may not have got the best possible policy, but it certainly did as good a job as I think I would have done. So I was so pleased not to have to do it myself. And I hope never to have to do a comparative insurance exercise again.
And about agents, would you classify social media bots as being agents too, in the sense that they're often given a task and they figure out what kind of ways to tweet or post online to produce that result?
Yeah, I think so. Like I say, the definition of an agent, as I understand it, is that it impacts the real world and that it operates partly without supervision. So that sounds like an agent, yeah.
I am seeing more and more of that. With the controversy over the Epstein files and what exactly is in there, people from multiple sides of the political debate are concocting pictures or fake testimonies, or they're taking testimonies and presenting them in different lights. Sometimes it's human intelligence, but I think there's a lot of AI agents doing some of the manipulations as well. It's something that worries me. So that's one of the trends I would point to. It's not just that AI is getting more powerful, as we talked about in the beginning. It's not just that AI could be used for cyber hacking. It's that AI is eroding a sense of a shared reality that we can all believe in. Because now whatever comes up on social media, there's always a question, well, can we trust this or not? Of course, we're all inclined to trust the things that reinforce our prejudices and our tribal loyalties, and we are distrustful of the things that seem to contradict it. It's a worrying development.
Yeah, I suppose so. But I think we've been around this loop many times. Every time a new media is invented, it amplifies the opportunity for people to produce misleading messages of various kinds. This may sound Pollyanna-ish, but I think by and large, over time, after getting used to the new medium, people apply a reasonable amount of skepticism. This was true of the printing press, it was true of radio and cinema and TV and the internet. Yes, we're all a bit gullible, but we're also all pretty skeptical. And yes, there's going to be much more online that you know is not real, that you know the images have either been adjusted or have been made up from scratch. We'll just accept that. I think in the medium term, we're going to have to reinvent the mainstream media. We're going to need media organizations which are trusted by almost everybody because they are known to be, above all, interested in conveying something as close to an impartial, objective view of what's happened as possible. There'll be some decent ones in the middle, and there'll be some outliers on the fringes which are less interested in that. I think we have to get back to that world. If we don't, we're sunk. The people running the media in the UK, at least, need to get a lot better at it because most of the newspapers in the UK seem very happy just make stuff up and tell lies completely without shame. And obviously the same is true in America. That's a very worrying development. But I don't really think it's driven by AI. I think it's driven by a period in which people of ill will have far too much power. And there's complicated reasons why that's happened. I think it's because people got very disillusioned. And they got very disillusioned because of the very fast rate of change in society. The world in many ways looks quite similar to the way it looked 50 years ago, but in other ways it's very, very different. White middle-class men are no longer top of the tree and everybody else has to accept their leavings. Women work. Black people and gay people are not victimized in the way that they used to be, and their victimization isn't sanctioned the way it was. I think that's just uncomfortable for a lot of people. That is where populism has come from, that much more than AI or social media or inequality. That unhappiness on the part of an enormous number of people is what's given license to these political charlatans and fraudsters. Political life goes in cycles. Going back in history a long way, there's been times when the prevailing political culture has been corrupt, and then there's times when it mostly isn't. I certainly think that's true of European history, which I've studied a lot, and I bet it's true of everywhere else. I think we're in a grim part of the cycle at the moment, but I don't think it will last forever.
The risk is that the pendulum will swing more and more violently. That it's not just going back and forth and back and forth. That would be manageable, but it's going to be more intense than before and swing right out of control. I remember we had an episode sometime in the middle of 2024 when we had a guest who said, yeah, people are going to get fed up of populism and extremes and they're going to revert back, much as you said, that we are able to trust our institutions and trust sensible political leaders. Sadly, that didn't really happen in the election in 2024. Things have got worse there. I was reading recently a very interesting book by Tim Urban, What's Our Problem? He also talks about a swing between a time when what he calls upper tier politics dominates, which is when we are more thoughtful and willing to have conversations with people who've got different views, and when lower tier politics dominates, which is when people are much more interested in revenge and self-preservation and are willing to cheat rather than follow the rules of the game. And if you get away with cheating, that's fine. Whereas upper tier says, well, we want to win, but we don't want to win by breaking the rules. And so there is a pendulum that swung. He wrote this book in 2023 when he also said, well, it looks like there is grounds for optimism about the future. But what's happened in 2024 and 2025 has in some sense been more alarming than before. So if there is going to be a swing back in the pendulum, it really has to happen soon.
I can remember in 2019 writing about how maybe Trump was a vaccination against fake news and that we were hopefully shortly going to be seeing the back of him and that we wouldn't make that mistake again for a generation. How wrong that was. The pendulum has always swung pretty violently. A century ago, in the 1930s, the pendulum swung about as violently as it's possible to get, and we ended up with a almost existential war. I'm just reading a book about the construction of cathedrals in the Middle Ages, what was called the Anarchy in the UK, which is one of the UK's many civil wars, a war between King Stephen and would-be Queen Maud. And people were lamenting the fact that there was no rule of law in England at the time because this civil war was going on, and anybody with an army just did whatever they liked in their local area. That was different from what people had grown up with. They'd grown up with peace. So the pendulum does swing. It does swing very, very violently. We're in a bad way at the moment, but it's nowhere near as bad as it has been in the past. The thing that is perhaps worrying, you're right, that the speed of information transmission, the availability of tools to help people make up false information very quickly, that may accelerate and exacerbate the swing of the pendulum. But also the other thing is that if I'm right and that where all this really stems from is a fear of change and unhappiness about change, that of course isn't going away. Change is only going to accelerate. Change has never been so fast before, but it will never again be so slow. So it's not impossible that the unhappiness is only going to get worse and worse and worse, in which case the future is not so good. However, I still think, you look at the world today, look at the way most people live, it is so much better than at any previous time in human history. That does give me some grounds for optimism.
So I'm with you in the sense that I think we can pull out of this very unhelpful pendulum swing by showing people that the change is going to lead us into a better world.
Yeah.
Whereas many people don't believe that currently. Many people see the change and they feel, oh, we are being kicked out of our previous roles in society. There's a status dissonance. They thought they deserved to be respected more. They're not getting respect. They seem to be losing their jobs. Calum, you and I are both inclined to accept the thesis of the economic singularity, which you wrote about first, which is that there will be fewer jobs for most people at some stage reasonably soon. And in that case, more people may feel even more angry and upset about the situation.
Well, if and when the economic singularity happens, and you and I both think it will, and we're in a world where there are no jobs for most humans because machines, AIs and robots can do pretty much everything humans can do for money, and they can do it cheaper, better and faster. If and when we hit that world, if we don't have a plan for how to redistribute the wealth that's being created, then there isn't just going to be unhappiness. There's going to be massive starvation, and there's going to be riots. There's going to be complete social breakdown. We really must create a blueprint for what that redistribution looks like. It is continually amazing to me that so few people are thinking seriously about this. And I think there's two main reasons why not. One is it's a bit scary. It sounds like science fiction, and so people just don't want to think about it. And the other is a concern which always pops up into everybody's heads, and they think this is the real problem. And I think it's the wrong problem. The thing that worries people when you mention this initially, if they take it at all seriously, they think, how will we get meaning in our lives? How will we create meaning if we don't have jobs? A lot of the people who are prepared to think about that are people who do get meaning from their jobs. They're highly educated and their jobs do more than just put food on the table. But that's not true for most people. Many surveys have shown that around about 85% of people around the world do not get anything like meaning from their jobs. And I think even the 15% who do get some meaning from their jobs, they get most of their meaning really from their family and from their friends and from their hobbies and their interests. I don't think finding meaning is going to be the problem in a world where effectively everybody is on a full-time vacation, or if you like, everybody has retired rich. That world could be a great world, and we should work to make that a great world. The big hurdle, I think, is that currently we don't have any way of redistributing the enormous wealth the machines will be creating to everybody around the world. Imagine a world where Elon Musk and Sam Altman own most of the means of production, which is not implausible. Maybe it's going to be actually a few thousand people in Silicon Valley, a few thousand people in China, and that's pretty much it. Why would those people agree to share everything that they have, or at least a big chunk of everything they have, in order to keep the other 8 billion or so of us alive? Now, actually, I think they might. They might well be well disposed enough to do that, just because they don't want to see everybody starve. With some exceptions, including one of the people I've already mentioned, I don't think most of them are psychopaths. But even if they want to, how you do that redistribution is really challenging. How do you make sure that everybody in Somalia and Italy and New Zealand and Iceland has got a really good standard of living, and that the assets are being redistributed in a way that everybody thinks is fair, or at least everybody thinks is fair enough? That is a huge challenge, and it's one I want to get back to more next year. I want to really have another big go at tackling that. In my book, The Economic Singularity, I got as far as asking the question. I didn't really come up with much by way of an answer other than the hunch that it's got something to do with abundance, with the fact that everything you need to enjoy a really good standard of living should become very, very cheap. Not free, but very, very cheap. And that would mean that taxing the people who own all the assets wouldn't be too onerous for them to bear. But that's nowhere near a complete answer. That's just a hunch at a gesture at the answer.
I'm with you that the solution in principle involves the superabundance that the AI and the robots can generate. Ample clean energy, the huge amounts of nutritious food, all the requirements for a good life. In principle, there's ample to be distributed. And the question is, well, how could the distribution be agreed without people complaining it's unfair? Maybe they'll be less complaint-minded if they see that there really is a lot for everybody. But even then, once there is an agreement, what's going to make the agreement stick? Because the people who are in positions of power may be disinclined to follow through with it if they are, in some sense, psychologically egotistical. if they prefer people who look like them and they're not that inclined to give money to others that they perceive to be freeloaders or some inferior members of society. And there are plenty of people who do speak like this. They don't want their own, what they perceive to be hard-earned money to be redistributed to others they perceive to be freeloaders. So there's figuring out what the system of distribution should be, and then there's the mechanisms that will guarantee that people will conform to it, even when they might change their mind. If they have power, it may corrupt them. So I think we've got to figure out how we can make people more like angels and less like these psychopaths. We're going to need to have an abundance, not just of material well-being, but an abundance of emotional well-being too. And that's a controversial idea, but just as I believe we can rejuvenate people physically so that we no longer age, I think it should be possible for us to use wise technology so that we relax and we become thoughtful, considerate people rather than narrow, egotistical, grasping people.
That sounded like a sermon, David, almost religious.
Well, it has some religious aspects. We need to see the better humanity that could be born. We are being collectively reborn with the power of technology if used wisely.
Yeah, I don't mean to be quite as cynical as that sounded. We shouldn't close this without talking a little bit about longevity. It's a favourite subject and very, very important. You're closer to that than I am these days. So where are we in the science of longevity?
Well, one of the good things about the progress of AI is it's allowing us to do some things better than ever before. So just one example, which also plays to the earlier theme of how much progress AI is making, despite all the critics saying, hey, nothing is happening. One example is by the company Retro Biosciences, which, by the way, has benefited from support from OpenAI, amongst others. They have designed new proteins to replace two of the so-called Yamanaka factors. Yamanaka is a Nobel laureate from Japan. He figured out a while ago that if there were 4 proteins introduced to a cell, the cell would reverse its aging. It would actually go back from being a normal cell to a stem cell. But if you did it with just a shorter period of time, it would retain the kind of cell nature it was. So a skin cell would remain a skin cell, but it would be a youthful skin cell rather than an elderly skin cell. So these 4 Yamanaka factors are very exciting in principle. There's lots of research being done on them, but people are trying to come up with better versions of them. And that's what Retro Biosciences have done. So they have taken 2 of the Yamanaka 4 factors. The 4 of them altogether are called OSKM. And the S stands for SOX2, which biologists may know about. And they've got a new version of that called RetroSOX, which has never existed in nature. But it does all the same things. And their K factor, KLF4, they've got a new version of that called RetroKLF. They've designed it by taking advantage of knowledge about how proteins will form and fold up in 3 dimensions. And by some measures, there's a 50-fold efficiency impact, which means that when you use these 2, rather than the original 2, you get much more of the cells being rejuvenated rather than just a small number. And the whole reprogramming can take place more quickly as well. So that's just one example of how AI might allow us to solve long-standing questions in biochemistry and rejuvenation. I'm not saying that this rejuvenation by itself is going to solve aging completely, but it is likely part of it. What AI can't do, however, and where we're still going to need human biologists to roll up their sleeves, perhaps with the help of some robotic lab assistants, is to collect the data, which will be able to inform AIs. All the great breakthroughs in AI have depended upon previous phases in which data was collected. So the breakthroughs of AI vision system, the AlexNet that was produced in 2012, depended upon the prior work of Fei-Fei Li of Stanford in collecting this large number of images which were labeled and that could be used to train AI. Similarly, the protein folding software, AlphaFold, that was developed by DeepMind in London, that depended on decades worth of work in which human scientists figured out by all kinds of clever means how a small number of proteins folded up in 3 dimensions, and they could determine these structures exactly. And once enough data had been collected, then clever AI could then solve the general protein folding problem. Similarly, We need more experiments to be done fairly quickly in figuring out what's going to happen when various aging damage repair interventions are applied in cells, so we can see which parts of the cells have their damage repaired and which parts still have damage remaining. Because in order to abolish aging, it's not enough just to undo one type of damage, such as the epigenetic damage, which these Yamanaka epigenetic reprogramming factors seem to be able to handle. There are lots of other types of damage, and we're going to need to still work on collecting data. It's possible that we'll soon have more data from mouse experiments, which I'm doing with one of my hats on at LEVF, Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. Hopefully, in the next couple of years, we'll have much more data as to what happens when a whole bunch of different damage repair mechanisms are applied at the same time. And then we can feed that data into an AI, and the AI will be able to say, you know what, let's modify this in a little bit and modify this other treatment a little bit, and that will be the comprehensive solution. So I'm still hopeful that we will have these insights by, say, 2035, possibly even sooner. But that's going to depend upon people doing these actual research projects. Strangely, all the focus on AI is a bit of a distraction because some people are saying all we need to do is build better AI. But no, AI can't do some things until the data has been collected.
So that prompts me to ask what is probably a pretty naive question, which is when Fei-Fei Li created ImageNet, the data that she gathered had to be labeled.
Yep.
The heroic job that she and her colleagues did was to attach labels to millions of images. Now the data doesn't need to be labeled. The transformer technology doesn't use label data, it just needs lots and lots of data. Presumably the data that you're talking about, these medical applications requiring, that also doesn't need to be labeled. So I understand your point that there need to be a lot more experiments done, but couldn't you make available enormous amounts of data simply by turning on a fire hose of all the world's health services and allowing AIs access to that? I'm sure they don't at the moment. I'm sure no model has access to all the world's medical data. In theory, if we felt like trusting them, we might not want to do that, but if we felt like trusting Gemini, if we gave it full access to all the world's medical systems data that they've ever collected, would that be an enormous step forward or not?
Well, the UK is actually doing some of this. The UK has the world's largest collection of medical data now with one of its initiatives, and people sign up voluntarily. They know what's going to happen, that their data is going to be shared. We'll put the information in the show notes. But again, this depends on various treatments being trialed. And what is under discussion is treatments that have never been trialed before. The Yamanaka factors have never been tried in any scale on humans, for example, nor have the new ones been trialed. And you can't be sure in advance what's going to happen. You can't solve from first principles a lot of these problems. It would be like deciding from first principles how many planets will there be in our solar system.
Yeah.
You can't work out in advance how everything's going to fall together. So you need to actually look and see.
Yeah. In which case, I guess the other thing that needs to be unlocked is we need to get able to perform the experiments much faster.
Yeah.
Which means, I guess, inevitably in a less regulated way. Liz Parrish has famously been experimenting on herself, and she gets a lot of criticism for that. But the way forward, surely, she's directionally right. We need to not have any possible therapy only processed through very, very slow, very expensive medical tests. We need to be able to churn through the experiments much quicker, which means Liz's approach of just try it. Try it on some humans, not just mice. Try it on some humans who are up for it immediately and as big scale as possible. Are we going to have to redo the way we do medical trials?
Well, many regulators are open to that idea. They are looking for ways of doing some experiments more quickly, especially if people can point to the fact they've got a fatal condition. Then you can, in certain parts of the world, request a new treatment if there's nothing available, which is a right to try legislation. So some of that's there. But the drawback is that you often get N=1 trials. A person took a treatment and there was a result, but it isn't clear what was the cause. Maybe they recovered for all kinds of other reasons, which is why you need to have more people involved. That's why in LEVF, the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, we're trialing first on mice, because mice lifespan is much shorter than humans. We trial them on middle-aged mice, which is 18 months when they start, with a potential additional lifespan. We'd expect them to live normally another 12 months. And if we give them enough treatments, we hope they will live another 24 months. So the experiments can be finished within 24 months. If there is a good result, it won't automatically translate into humans because there are many things that happen in humans that don't happen in mice and vice versa. But the basic principle may well be established that if you apply enough of these damage repair interventions in parallel, you get a much better result than you can get from any of them individually. And when we can do that, then there will be lots of demand for going faster. Like there was the demand for going faster with the COVID vaccines, which some people regret and consequently say maybe the vaccines weren't trialed carefully enough. But I think the balance is that when the world really puts its mind to it, if there really is a determination we should have a war against aging, similar to the war against COVID, but even more determined, we will find ways of doing trials on humans more quickly as well. But that demand is not going to be unlocked until people see similar results in mice.
Fascinating. Well, I think that's probably a great way to end. We need a war against aging. It'd be nice if we could also have a war against populism, but that's probably not coming anytime soon. So, David, I'll just take this opportunity to wish you and all our listeners a very happy and prosperous 2026. And let's hope we get to the end of it.
Let's hope we have a wonderful 2026 in which abundance becomes more credible, in which people take some of these subjects more seriously, and we can see a route to not just rejuvenating our physical bodies, but our key institutions and our key mental states as well. That may be a naive hope, but I'd much rather have an optimistic hope than be a doomer.
Amen.